what's my tell me about yourself, or tell us about yourself question. And how are you going to answer that? That question, in my opinion, is one of the most important questions because it makes or breaks the energy of the rest of the interview. And what I mean by that is if you come to me, Brad, and you say, hey, Erin, tell me about yourself. And I'm like, well, I did this and I had some of this. And then I sort of get lost in telling a story about this other thing. And then I'm back over here. After a while, your eyes start to glaze because I haven't taken a breath. I haven't really chosen a direction that I'm going. I don't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then I haven't left space for you to ask me follow-up questions. So that tell me about yourself, I think is really important to get it down to, a couple of minutes. It's not so much about the time, it's about, so I have this analogy. I tell people, pretend you just bought a new house and you have your friend over. And depending on the friend, right, which is like depending on the interview, you're going to give a slightly different tour of your house. So if you have a friend who's really into cars and you just got a house that has a 4-car garage and you can, work on cars in your garage and that's a shared interest that you have, you're probably going to spend a little more time talking about the garage and the features of the garage. You're not going to walk them into your half bath and be like, and here's the half bathroom and let me tell you all about the tile. And right, like you don't spend as much time on that because that's not what your friend is interested in hearing about. And so thinking about your tell me about yourself as almost like a tour through a house. You're acknowledging the house and the rooms in the house, but you're spending a little more time on key areas of the house that you know that your friend or your visitor is interested in hearing about because they have a connection or maybe an interest in that. And I think that's the tell me about yourself as well, too. It's really about knowing the stops along the way in the story that you want to tell that helps make that polished and not get lost to where you sort of lose them in the first answer, and then everybody's doing other things and not paying attention.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Job Seeker's Journey podcast. I have 3 interviews this week, and we will be returning to new episodes starting next week with some amazing guests that I cannot wait for you to hear from. But today, I would like to go back and revisit one of the most impactful and most listened to and most engaging conversations that I've had to date with my friend, Erin Lewber. If you've listened to any episode before, you know that I have stated that she's one of my favorite people that I have talked to date. And from the feedback that I have gotten from many of you, I know that this episode is extremely impactful, important, and something that really helps you in your journey to find your next opportunity. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Erin Lewber about how to improve your interview skills. All right, so I'm here with Erin Lewber. And you're one of the people that I have seen on LinkedIn. There's a few people that I've had on this podcast. It's the same situation where I've just come across posts that you've made. Somebody liked it. It just showed up in my feed, whatever it is. And then I just grow to love what you're writing, either about resumes or any other topic that you had. So I came across you and I was just so excited to get to send you a message and just, tell you that I liked that. And then you were so gracious to come on here. So why don't, before we get started on interviews, I'll let you introduce yourself and kind of give a little bit of your background, and then we can get going.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I always feel like it's overly flattering to be like, you were so gracious to come out here. I'm like, thanks for inviting me. This is fun. I love a chance to talk with people from LinkedIn. And so my background, I've got a really interesting background. I grew up in a family business, started in the retail world. I've made 2 career pivots myself. So I moved from the retail grocery world to the recruiting world. That's where I learned the whole business of getting a job, really like what happens end to end behind the scenes, hiring managers, and saw it in a lot of volume and scale because I worked with a lot of candidates and I worked with a lot of hiring managers in a lot of different big Fortune 500 companies. So really good education there to just to see the spectrum of what happens. And it really, I would say, taught me that there isn't one way to do anything perfectly. And that's probably the first nugget I would give is anybody who's telling you like, this is the one way you have to do it. And this is the way that works every time. It's never true because humans are involved.
Mhm.
But after recruiting, I had my kids while I worked in the recruiting industry. I worked for some smaller companies, and it was tough. It was tough to have maternity leave working for some smaller companies. I had some really crummy things happen to me during maternity leave. Had sales commissions taken, and I just thought, all right, I need to change. And I'd been in sales, and I always wanted to work for Amazon and set my sights very specifically on Amazon. So I woke up every morning, went to McDonald's, bought a $1 giant iced tea, and would sit and use their Wi-Fi before I went to work every morning. And I would work on my, story and my resume and all my experiences and like what was I going to do and who was I networking with. And this was back in like 2016 leading into 2017. And people weren't really using LinkedIn like they do today. The pandemic really got us all going on LinkedIn in a much like it really exploded. But I practiced what I preach, and I reached out to a guy who lived in Detroit who worked for Amazon in sales. Like that was my search, and said, "Hey, you're doing this thing that I would really like to do. Would you ever talk to me?" And he was nice enough to say, "Yeah, let's schedule a time to chat." And we did, and our 20-minute chat turned into an hour. And at the end, he said, "Hey, why don't you send your resume over? I know my team's hiring. I'll pass it along." And that got my foot in the door for, the initial phone screen and then the Amazon interview loop and all of that. And the rest is history. In the midst of all of this, it was the journey to get here. And I just kind of threw it all out there in about, 30 seconds. But it was tough. Like there weren't resources and people helping me, and the change from retail to recruiting involves like a family business falling apart and a lot of emotions. And in all of it, I said, if I ever figure this out someday, like I'm going to turn around and do something with this. And that's where I got going into doing my career coaching and leadership development work that I do through LinkedIn. And I went through a coaching certification program and really started to lean in on the resumes and interviewing skills and, how to navigate the job search, how to tell your story specifically for career pivoters, because I know what it feels like so intimately to know you have like all these great skills, but you're not really sure how to repackage them and tell someone else about them so that they see what you know you have. And I think that is probably one of my secret skills that I have is I'm really good at talking to somebody for a while and saying, okay, so here's how I see you, and helping somebody fall in love with the version of them that already exists. They're just too used to seeing it to know that it's as great as it is.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. That's a tough deal to really be able to package yourself into what you think they're looking for. Cause it's, sometimes in some ways it's kind of a guesswork. You can do as much research as you can, but you never really know until you get in that room.
Yeah.
And you really don't even know what they're thinking afterwards. Cause some of the ones that I've been in that I've thought have been amazing just didn't end up working out or whatever. So you really never know until you hear that feedback at the end, and hopefully they give you feedback. But
yeah,
I thought maybe we could start this on a little bit of a fun note.
Okay.
What is a really memorable job interview that either one of your clients has had or you have had that was either it was really great, maybe it was terrible, funny, or anything like that, but just kind of what was the most memorable one that you have?
Okay. I'm going to give you one this was when I worked in the recruiting industry. So just for context, my job, I ran a team that had salespeople and recruiters. And my job was really to own these account relationships and make sure the whole thing worked. So we had candidates who we were working with, and we were presenting them to clients, and we would walk them into interviews. So it was really pretty customary for me to be on site, meeting with the candidate, saying, okay, you showed up on time, you're dressed appropriately, you brought all the right things with you. If you were supposed to bring samples of your work or things like that, we'd do a little prep before I sent them into the interview. They'd come out. I'd be like, how did it go? What did they ask you? So there was this one candidate, and she, came cruising through the door like 1 minute before her interview was supposed to happen. So already not the best start, but we get her all settled, we send her in, and she comes out, and there's this look on the hiring manager's face. Like, she just looked like she was shocked. And I thought, okay, this can't be good. So we do our pleasantries, goodbye, and I tell the candidate, all right, thanks for everything. And the hiring manager comes back around and says, I need to talk to you. We had a real problem here. You have to tell your candidates that they can't touch their interviewers because the woman in the middle of the interview stood up, went and helped herself to a cup of coffee from like this area that was nowhere near the interview, and then got up and was massaging the shoulders of the interview team and was like touching them. It made everyone very uncomfortable. And I mean, you talk about things that you would never think somebody would do in an interview. I guess my assumption is like most of us probably know, like we might shake hands with somebody, but we wouldn't touch another person like and get into their space. And apparently this woman was like touching everybody's shoulders. And I had to have a very uncomfortable conversation with a client about how did you send this person in and why was this person touching everybody? And needless to say, she did not get the job. But it started this whole kind of joke that like, wow, we have to remind everybody now, like, just to be clear, like, you should never touch anybody when you go into the interview. Like, we started telling people this because it's just the stuff that you don't realize might happen once. And then when it happens, it's like, I guess we should probably mention that to everybody from now on, just in case.
Yeah.
So
it's one of those age-old things of when you see a weird thing that someone either says to you or a weird warning on a product, and then you kind of realize, this is on here for a reason. Someone has done this.
Right.
And then you kind of feel sad for them and you're like, oh my gosh, how did you think that was okay? But wow, that's a good one. That's a good one. I think the craziest interview I've been a part of is I was moving to Oklahoma City from Tulsa to get married. And so I was looking for a job. I got this interview at a really big oil and gas company that was really hard to get an interview at all. And I was really excited about it. My wife actually worked there. It was going to be a great situation. So I was really excited about it. It was a phone interview. And when I got on the phone, it was clear from the very start that whoever the hiring manager was did not care about this interview and pawned it off on two people that I'm pretty sure were just walking down the hall 5 minutes before this and said, hey, you two go talk to this guy. Because when we got in, they didn't know what they were interviewing for. That was one thing. Then the first question I got was, well, okay. So tell me about yourself. And I said, is there anything specific you'd like to know? Because I was like, do you want to know my, like, where I was born, or do you want to know just my professional history? Like, what do you want to know here?
Yeah.
And they said, just start talking and we'll ask questions from there. And I said, okay. And so I said, well, I'm going to spare you my personal stuff. So how about I just start with the professional stuff? And so I started walking through that. They asked me 2 questions about 2 companies that really had nothing to do with what the job description was at all. And at the end of my 5 minutes of telling them about myself, they said, okay, do you have any questions for us? And I said, no, I guess I don't. And they said, okay, we'll let you know. And that was the interview. And I thought, oh man, it's one of the first few that I knew I wasn't going to get in the first 5 minutes. And I wanted out of there before I even started talking because I knew this was a waste of time. But that's probably been the worst interview I've been a part of for myself. And luckily, most of them go a lot better than that. But that one was an interesting one.
Yeah, that's rough. That really, it's so frustrating. I think that I'm a bit spoiled now that, working at Amazon, I will say Amazon has one of, I think, the best interview experiences. They really set the bar for how to interview well, meaning everyone who interviews has to go through a standard curriculum and be approved to interview before you can interview anyone. You have to shadow other interviewers, and then you have to do a reverse shadow to prove that you have the skills and you know how to properly follow the right steps and do this sort of, like in line with how we want everyone to interview. And then, you do a phone screen typically, and then the loop, if you've heard people talk about the loop at Amazon, it's like basically 5 1-hour interviews back to back to back to back to back. Sometimes it's spread over 2 days now that we do them virtually, but it's, on the one hand, it's super intense because it's like you're gearing up to just go run a marathon of interviewing. But having been through it, I will say, like, once you get in that groove of, okay, we're here, we're talking about this, I did my prep, I have my examples, I'm ready to go, like, let's get it done, right? I know before we jumped on here, we were chatting a little bit, and you said, you've had ones where it's like 7 rounds of interviews.
Mm-hmm.
We do 5 back-to-back interviews, and then within the next 5 business days, you have an answer on whether you're hired or not.
That is nice.
Now, there can be a lot of back and forth between when you start and all that kind of stuff, but it's like you use phone screen. If you move forward, we're going to set up the loop. You're going to do the loop. The loop is going to be intense, but once that loop is done, the team needs to come together. We need to debrief on it. We all take notes. We have like an entire process to make sure there aren't biases in the process. It's very standardized, and then you get an answer. And I think that, when you look at companies that don't have rigor or process around how they hire, it's just a lose-lose for everybody. I mean, the company is missing out on great candidates because you're not providing a great candidate experience. You're sort of leading with this chaos, and who wants to go work somewhere where it seems like even the interview process is a mess? And, and for the candidate, like, what a waste of your time. Like, how disrespectful, that you clear your schedule and you do spend time preparing and knowing. We were also talking about how long some people lately are on the job search, and you get this hope that, okay, I got my interview, I have my shot. And if it turns out to be one of these things where they're just kind of a hot mess when they show up, like, what a bummer,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and it's you're exactly right, because that kind of leads into kind of my first question about actual interviews. But you spend all this time, we've talked about job strategies and looking and networking and doing all this work to try to get to the stage of where they are going to actually talk to you.
Yeah.
But let's talk about a little bit about preparing, because you hear people talk about preparing for an interview. They always say, do research on the company, do research on, if you know the person who's interviewing, try to do some research on them. But what are some strategies that you tell your people, or even rituals that you may have for them so that they can optimize that very first interview?
Yeah. So I would say the biggest thing is to start practicing before you get the interview request. So when you're in a job search, I am not going to sugarcoat it. There's a lot of stuff that you have to do kind of all at once, right? You're networking, you're applying, you're doing all these things. You might still be in a job. You might have family members and things that you're trying to take care of in life. And so it's a lot of juggling. But when I work with clients, we always talk about the core questions. We know the tell me about yourself question. 99.9999% sure somebody's going to ask you some version of that question when you get into an interview, almost every time. So if we know that you're going to be asked that question, let's start practicing that answer now so that when the interview request rolls in, that's not one of the things you're worried about. Now you're focused on sort of those level 2 questions, level 3 questions that are really nuanced, more specific to the company, more specific to the requirements of the role. Those might be things you need to practice a little bit more. But you've got your core stuff down pat about, why are you looking right now? What has led you to a point where you're looking for a role? They usually compound that and will say, well, why XYZ company? Why is now the right time for XYZ company? So I would say leading into it well before an interview, you do have to factor in and start saying, what is my elevator pitch of me? What's my tell me about yourself, or tell us about yourself question? And how are you going to answer that? That question, in my opinion, is one of the most important questions because it makes or breaks the energy of the rest of the interview. And what I mean by that is if you come to me, Brad, and you say, hey, Erin, tell me about yourself. And I'm like, well, I did this and I had some of this. And then I sort of get lost in telling a story about this other thing. And then I'm back over here. After a while, your eyes start to glaze because I haven't taken a breath. I haven't really chosen a direction that I'm going. I don't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then I haven't left space for you to ask me follow-up questions. So that tell me about yourself, I think, is really important to get it down to, a couple of minutes. It's not so much about the time. It's about, so I have this analogy. I tell people, pretend you just bought a new house and you have your friend over. And depending on the friend, right, which is like depending on the interview, you're going to give a slightly different tour of your house. So if you have a friend who's really into cars and you just got a house that has a 4-car garage and you can, work on cars in your garage, and that's a shared interest that you have, you're probably going to spend a little more time talking about the garage and the features of the garage. You're not going to walk them into your half bath and be like, and here's the half bathroom and let me tell you all about the tile. And right, like you don't spend as much time on that because that's not what your friend is interested in hearing about. And so thinking about your tell me about yourself as almost like a tour through a house. You're acknowledging the house and the rooms in the house, but you're spending a little more time on key areas of the house that that your friend or your visitor is interested in hearing about because they have a connection or maybe an interest in that. And I think that's the tell me about yourself as well, too. It's really about knowing the stops along the way in the story that you want to tell that helps make that polished and not get lost to where you sort of lose them in the first answer and then everybody's doing other things and not paying attention.
Yeah, you can totally tell that when they're checked out. And it's harder now that it's a lot of time on Zoom.
Yeah.
There's a lot of great things about Zoom in that, I actually find it a little bit more relaxing because, you only have to dress up from your waist up. That's
right.
one thing. So
right?
that's an automatic thing that's a little bit of relaxing. You're typically in your house in a room that you feel comfortable in. But the downside of that is that you do have a hard time being able to pick up, are people engaged in this? Am I keeping their attention? I've had an interview before that I ended up getting the job where I was convinced that one of the people on the interview hated me because
why did you think that?
He wasn't paying attention at all. Like he was clearly still working while he was in the interview. He would ask some questions and then the looks that he would kind of give to me were not of, I like this guy.
Yeah.
Was like, I'm kind of annoyed that I'm here right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just convinced he didn't like me. Turns out that's just kind of his personality and kind of he's from an area of the world that like they're a little bit rougher. Okay. And so that's just his demeanor.
Okay.
But I didn't know that at the time. And I was convinced that he hated me at the beginning. But so being that you were in recruiting and kind of this, what would you say is with the different rounds of interviews, you have your initial interview, your second, maybe third. What are the goals of, say, the very first interview for a company? Are they just looking to see if they like you and that you maybe have some core skills that they're looking for, or are they looking for anything specific? What would you say, especially in that first interview?
Yeah, I think you're headed down the right path, actually. It's typically, a lot of time it's just a phone call. It might be on Zoom, but oftentimes that first request you'll get is that phone screen. Maybe it's 30 minutes. And really what they want to do is they want to get onto the phone with you and validate a conversation against what was in your resume. So hopefully the way that this worked was you put together a resume that was powerful enough to say, I have the things you're looking for. They're going to get on that 30-minute call. A lot of times it's with a recruiter if, the company is of a decent size where they have a recruiting team. And that recruiter's job is really to vet you as a candidate, to say, does this person have the things I believe they have? Do they, when I talk with them, can they talk to me in a little bit of a deeper way? Can they tell me how they've used Java in their development career? Or can they tell me how they've used Microsoft Project in more detail. And it's really just getting like a confidence confirmation. Again, if it's a recruiter who's working that job, that's really one of the recruiter's core jobs, is helping to manage that candidate pipeline and to vet those candidates so that hopefully, as the professional who does this day in and day out, in 30 minutes, they can get a good sense of, are you a generally aligned candidate? And if so, they can confidently pass that on then to the next step, which is typically with the hiring team or hiring manager, just depending on how the company does it. So yeah, that first interview is really about, it's going to be more skills confirmation, more general alignment, maybe a couple questions like a tell me about yourself and, why are you interested in XYZ company? And it's a gut check. Once you get past the first one, then you get into more of the deep dive, the digging into your skills, qualifications, experiences. Tell me about a time when. I want to understand how you think, how do you process things, how do you problem solve, how are you to work with as a person. And, the number of rounds will vary. I strongly disagree with how many organizations interview. I don't think there's often a lot of thoughtfulness in why they're asking you to go through the number of rounds that they do. And I think there's a general perception that if we put you through enough rounds with enough people, then somebody's going to figure out if you're going to, not be the right person, and we're going to sound the alarm and save ourselves the trouble. I believe that there's a point of diminishing returns, that once you get past 2 or 3 interviews, especially if you're bringing multiple people into each of those interviews, and you need to look at the scope of the role and the experience level. If you're bringing someone in entry level and you've got them going through 4 rounds of interviews, and it's with the VP of blah blah blah, like there is no reason an entry level person for a role needs to have 4 rounds of interview up to and including with a VP of something. Like that screams micromanagement to me.
Sure.
And so, every company is different, but I actually use the interview process as an insight point for my clients. So when I work with somebody, one of our first questions that we always ask the person who reaches out for the interview is, could you tell me a little bit about the interview process and what I should expect over the coming weeks? How many rounds, who will I be speaking with? Ask that proactively. Don't wait for them to tell you what that is, because sometimes it's a little muddy, and then candidates will say, well, I didn't really say, what it was going to be. Ask the question, because you want to understand and you want to level set that playing field of, what am I signing up for here? Because maybe what they're going to have you do, you don't want to do. Maybe you don't want to do 7 rounds of interviews with a company.
Yeah.
And best to know that on the front end, and then politely maybe say, look, thank you, but no thanks.
Sure. I've also heard it said, and this will make sense to you, sir, certainly with sales, time kills all deals. So,
yeah.
I had a recruiter one time that became more of a mentor to me than even just a recruiter. And he was always telling me, not only try to figure out what the next step is, but try to get them to commit to a time frame while you're on the phone, and try to help dictate that so that you're not in limbo, because that is a hard part, is that a lot of times nowadays, not only are you going through multiple rounds with multiple people, which I would argue you could get 2 of those people at least in the same Zoom call and cut down on the number of rounds and not have to make it over the course of 2 or 3 weeks. You could make it over the course of a week. But then you have no idea, when are you going to hear back? When is the next round scheduled for now? Do you have a schedule for this?
Yeah.
Is your CEO out of town? Whatever the thing may be. So let's talk about, especially in the middle rounds, when you start getting into more technical things. So I'm a project manager by trade. But when you start getting into those middle rounds and they start asking you more specific questions about what they're looking for, let's say they hit you with a curveball. You've prepared, you've thought about what you think they're going to ask you based on the job description, based on the company, based on your experience, and then they just hit you with a complete curveball. What do you think is the right strategy for a huge curveball question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, and hopefully you have prepared enough. Like when I practice with someone, we talk about your core stories. So what we do is we look at the requirements of any job, and then we say, okay, what are the core stories that we want to have in your bank, basically, that we can pull from? And we work with those a lot to make sure that you're so comfortable with them that you can kind of play around with them and rearrange the story. So I found that even if you get a curveball, a lot of times, as long as you've prepared core stories and the core stories align to really, project management, they're going to ask you about maybe different projects that you managed of a certain discipline. If you work in construction, they're going to want to know about construction project manage or projects that you've done. And they're going to want to know about the size and the scope of them and your delivery and how many stakeholders you had and maybe some of the tools you used and maybe what went wrong or right or all these kind of things. If you try to anticipate that, hopefully there's something that you can pull from and wing it. And it is truly where practicing a lot just kind of helps you BS your way through an answer. I'm not going to lie. If you really can't come up with something, there's something to be said for, wow, I've just really never thought about that answer, or I really can't recall a time at this moment where I experienced that. Thinking about what you're asking, I think probably what you're most interested to understand is this. So that's another pivot that you can take. Every question that's asked in an interview has a purpose, right? There's the question, but there's what they really want to know. And so it might say, tell me about a time, this is my example I always use, tell me about a time you went above and beyond for a customer. I don't really care what your story is. That's not the point when I ask that. What I want to understand is, what is your definition of above and beyond, right? And then what did you do? What were you willing to do to accomplish that, whatever your definition of above and beyond is? So I want to know, what type of ownership do you have? How do you look at situations and really think about how to solve them creatively? These are the things I'm trying to pull out of your answer and understand about you as a candidate. So when you really don't have let's say you don't have an example of a time you went above and beyond for a customer, you might say, wow, I can't come up with something from my experience right off the top of my head, but I could see where a time where I went above and beyond for a customer, it'd be really important for you to understand how I work and how I look at my role within the organization. And, going above and beyond to me means this. And so even then you could kind of pivot away from that a little bit like a politician and start to say, this is what above and beyond means to me, or these are the types of things that I would see as above and beyond. And you can still fill that space with something of quality and something that shows how you're thinking and how you understand that. It probably is a little bit of a miss that you couldn't come up with an example, but you try to make the best of it. So hopefully lots of practice so you don't find yourself in that situation. And if you do, reframing it to, here's how I might approach something like that, or here's how I'm thinking about that, can still be a way to save it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the best pieces of advice that I got early on, I think in this round of my job search, was really trying to listen to and understand the interviewer before you go in, to try to find, how are they thinking? What is important to them? Just in general, if you can pick that up on LinkedIn, if they make posts, you can kind of figure out what is important to them. But if you are able to, and this is harder, and I'm not great at this, but if you are able to pick up the paralinguistic markers, if you can figure out that they are a visual learner or they're a visual person. So if you pick that up and you can say, okay, I need to have examples that I can help them visualize what I'm saying or what I did. and then try to phrase it in a way that is more of a visualization way instead of reading like a book, because that doesn't really work for them. But then you can also ask. I loved getting told to try to ask questions and get them talking more in the interview. So instead of you just always talk, if you can take the question that you got and find a way to return that question to them to learn more about their company, but then you're also learning what's important to them.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I've asked that question before, and I found out that taking ownership, because it was in project management, taking ownership was their biggest thing. That was where their biggest value that they put into project managers. Well, now I know that. And now in every answer that I go from there on out, I'm talking about aspects where I'm taking ownership of a project in some form or fashion. And I loved that. And then I got told, and I'm going to go ahead and share this with people because I love this question. I've gotten amazing answers from this, but especially if you figure out that they're a visual person, trying to ask a question similar to, we're going to play a hypothetical game. We've gone through this interview process. I love you. You love me. I'm now working there. A year from now, we're sitting in a conference room. We're walking down the hallway. We're sitting on a Zoom call, and we're looking back to the year that we just had. What is 2 or 3 things that we've accomplished together that we look back and say, man, this has been a great year? Because now you're trying to get them to visualize that you're there.
Yeah.
And you're putting yourself, and that you're working with them.
Right. You're
not
part
just
of the
doing things on
team,
your own.
right?
Right. So I've loved that. And it's, I mean, have I gotten a job necessarily from that yet? No, but interviews have gone much better because I've been able to get them talking to me and not only that, but you pick up on, again, what's the culture of this company, so that if you get a second one, now you're able to kind of work that in the next interview and know that, okay, they really value this.
Yeah.
And I need to make sure that I am on point in this area because they're really looking for something like that. But
you bring up a good point, actually, about the question asking part, when it's your turn to ask the questions. And I will say that's where I would say most candidates leave a lot of opportunity on the table. Is, they come in, couple of tips: know who you're talking to, make sure the questions you're asking them are questions that they can answer and that they're the right person to answer. I personally, even in my job right now, I'll get things like, well, can you tell me about the goals of this team? Well, let's say I'm helping to interview as the interview team for a partner team. I don't really deeply know that. I'm not the right person to talk about the goals and the day-to-day of that team. I can say, what I know about them from my perspective, but I don't work in that job. And so a lot of times when I think about the most memorable people who I walked out of that interview and I was like, I am hiring this person. They certainly did a good job with, end to end, the whole thing. But when it came time to ask questions, they were so thoughtful in how they asked questions. They asked questions that were appropriate to ask me that I could give them really good answers on. They asked questions that didn't have a simple, like, how do you like working there? Or, what's your favorite thing about working at XYZ company? Those types of questions. So many candidates ask those questions that they feel really, they blur together with everybody else. And so finding questions that are unique, questions that, like you mentioned, are going to help you understand the environment, the culture. Do you want to work there? I mean, that's the point of you asking those questions. Do I want to work here? So one of the tips that I oftentimes give is as a candidate, you get a lot of these questions of, tell me about a time when. And the reason we talk about that is because we want you to talk about a specific example, not hypotheticals. Well, I would do this or I would do that. We want to know what is a time when that actually happened and walk me through it. you can use that same technique when it's time for you to ask questions of your interviewer. Can you tell me about the last time you recognized someone for achievement within the team? What did that look like and how were they recognized? And to hear how they answer, now they have to give you an actual scenario. They can't say, "Oh yeah, we recognize people all the time and it's just really positive." And maybe you find out that the way that they do recognition, they think it's positive, but maybe you think it's totally a mismatch for what you would want in your culture that you're headed into. So flipping that, tell me about a time when you ask questions of your interviewer, I really like that technique because it makes them give you a more real answer rather than something that's sort of hypothetical or like, packaged up and cute.
Sure. Yeah. And certainly having a question is definitely.
And that too. Yeah. Don't say no. I don't have any questions because.
Right. Right. And then, or looking like a deer in a headlights as soon as they say that. Cause I know that you can see it on their face, that kind of, they're kind of looking at you like, I don't know about that, but
write the questions ahead of time, write the questions down. And it's a low key flex as a candidate when they say, "Do you have any questions for me?" to go, "Actually, yeah, I wrote some down while I was preparing to talk with you today." And then you look down like this and you say, "One of the things I was wondering about was this. This shows premeditation. This shows that you did work ahead of time. By saying, 'Let me look at the work that I did before I got on the line to talk to you,' it's actually giving a positive affirmation to your interviewer. When they say, 'Do you have any questions for me?' and you go, like this and look up at the sky, it signals unpreparedness. I'm making it up. I'm pulling something out of the air. And so that gives the signal that I haven't spent a lot of time on this ahead of time. I'm just going to pull something. And then when that thing you pull is like, 'How do you like working at XYZ company?' It's like, 'Oh man, you didn't think about this at all before you got here. How serious can this be?'
Yeah. Makes sense. It makes sense. So I think we've touched on it a little bit, but as we're kind of coming to an end here, what are some of the things that you're seeing that has been changing in the interview process? Because you hear a lot of people saying that it seems harder to get a job, whether that mean getting in the door or, a lot of people who maybe have gone through a lot of interview processes, it seems harder. You're now on Zoom. You're not doing as many in-persons, even though I would argue, especially if it's in the town that you're in, trying to get in person, at least for one of them, is a great thing. If they'll meet you for lunch or for breakfast or something like that, is a great thing to try to do, because it's a different conversation when you're eating and it's more casual and you can get more out of them. But what are there any other things that you've noticed in the interview process that has kind of changed recently with LinkedIn and all that you've noticed that maybe we should be aware of while we're looking?
Yeah, it's right now, it's definitely, I think we moved from one extreme to the other over the last several years. So during the pandemic, there was this massive boom of hiring that happened. And, we were working remotely and everyone was moving super fast and it was not business as usual in so many ways. And so I think the hiring process was accelerated and there were a lot of opportunities. So candidates were getting scooped up and it wasn't taking as long to get hired. Companies were fast to move because they needed 5 candidates, not just one. And that was fun and exciting in its own way. And then we had the responsibility that followed that of many organizations found that they overhired and they probably were maybe moved a little too quickly. And now they had, they needed to shrink their teams. And so we saw that happen with a lot of people, a lot of really talented people being displaced. And so I think the counter response that we've seen now is companies are being a little bit more careful and slow about how they hire. I've had a couple people where opportunities that they've been actively interviewing for have gone on hold because budgets have changed. So those are things that you can't control. You can do your research. You can try to find companies that haven't had layoffs recently. I think when you try to find companies that are a little bit more established and stable, when you get into an interview, a great question to ask is around, what is the reason for this opening? How did this opening come to be? Is this a backfill for somebody who has moved on? Is this a net new role because the team is expanding? It's really good to understand why this role exists, because a lot of times that can give you some clues around, have they thought this through and why did this opening come to be? But I think right now in the market, there's a lot of people looking. We've certainly economically had a lot, and just globally had a lot of shifts and big things happening and uncertainty. And so I think you're seeing a general slow, more intentional process, a more careful, conservative process with companies. And so, for the candidates, and there's this, kind of people out there looking. So you've got lots of candidates to choose from. You've got companies that want to be a little more careful, which means slower processes, which means sometimes they add a lot of dumb steps to the process because they think it's going to help them make a more sound decision if they put 7 interview rounds together and make you do a project that you spend your weekend on and all that stuff. But, I think when it comes down to it, you can never completely mitigate the risk of the stuff that might happen during an interview as a candidate. But what you can do is lots of proactive preparation to be your own advocate, research on the company to make sure you're walking into an organization that seems sound as much as you can validate that. And then you have your eyes and your ears open and you're not approaching it from oh gosh, I hope they pick me. And I know we all feel that way, right? It's
Sure.
really hard to not feel that way. Like you want to be picked, of course. But to not be so blinded by the desire to be chosen that you forget that you're also choosing them, and to make sure you keep that choosiness about yourself. You're asking tough questions. You're being thoughtful. You're really trying to suss out, is this a place where I want to go and spend the next 1 to 10 years, whatever of my life? And are there flags? And so, I think it's just a lot of really good, not too complicated practices. It's just really good, consistent behaviors and being methodical and trying to stay grounded as you go through it. And that's the best approach right now. Probably always, not right now, always for interviewing.
Sure. So just 2 more questions for you.
Yeah.
Let's talk about follow-up. I had a recruiter tell me to really try to do handwritten letters if you can, if you know where to send them, because no one sends those anymore. So it really kind of stands out that you took the time to write a letter, mail it, get it in the, get it to them. And I have actually had people make comments like, hey, thanks for the letter, whereas an email, rarely do you ever get a response. But what would you suggest for follow-up of an interview?
Yeah.
And then, is there any tips for crafting that follow-up to them?
So this is, remember at the beginning, I think this is when we were recording, I said, there's like a million different ways to go about doing stuff, right? There isn't just one way. And this is where I would probably disagree with somebody who said, send a handwritten letter. I think that worked back in the day because it was the norm. Nowadays, for instance, for me, I have received a handwritten letter from someone before. It showed up after we made the decision. Additionally, I may only, according to practice, like the rules and to be a fair hiring evaluation, I only evaluate what happens during that 1 hour when we talk. And so the extra stuff is lovely, but it really doesn't change my decision because my decision is based on the facts and the information you shared in the conversation. So I think that the next, really, I know not all companies work that way, like Amazon does. So I think an email is the most timely because you want to get that in there. If it's going to help influence the decision, you want it to be there when the decision is being made. So as much as the handwritten note is different and thoughtful, it's slow and it tends to move slower than the pace at which decisions are made. So you might not reap the benefits of it. When you write an email, I would say short, spell their name right, You'd be amazed the number of people who do not spell people's names correctly. And it's a detail, right? LinkedIn exists, look it up, figure it out, ask the recruiter, make sure you get it right. And then use this as an opportunity to stand out again, to show that you are paying attention, doing your homework. So my tip that I always give to clients is take one thing from the interview that was memorable and repeat and expand upon it ever so slightly. Brad, it was so great to speak with you. After talking, I just love how you shared how your team did X, Y, and Z. And I could really see where it made a lot of sense to move from this to this. I was thinking about the fact that you could have also maybe included this, and maybe that could be a really neat way if you encounter this again. So you're kind of saying, I'm taking this moment that actually happened that's specific to our conversation, and I'm just making a small mention and expansion upon it. Thank you again for your time. I'm really hopeful to join the team, blah, 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 sign your name. I mean, the point is that you want to get it in there, have it be timely, have it say something that shows thoughtfulness and isn't like you stole it from a Microsoft Word template or had ChatGPT write it, and get it over there. And I think every company's hiring process is different, where maybe some people will factor that into their decision and maybe others, will not / like me cannot. And it's still a nice touch, but it will never be something for me that influences my decision, because I focus on the answers that happen during the interview only.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I like that. Okay. So last question. If I came to you and I came to your coaching service and I said, mm-hmm. Listen, I have been struggling with interviews and I'm looking for advice, what would be your biggest piece of advice for me? And, we'll just assume that I don't have any interviews going on. I'm just looking for, from beginning to end, what would be your biggest piece of advice?
One, anybody who's going to give you actionable, I can give tips all day long, right? I've given a bunch of tips just in our conversation. For you, Brad, I'm going to say, we're going to do a 1-hour mock interview. Let's grab a job description and let's do it. Show me what you're doing in this interview, because I cannot tell you how to improve if I don't see the nuance of what you're doing, because everybody shows up differently. So step one is we're going to actually create a scenario where I can observe you doing the thing that we need to, I think, improve, right? That's why we're talking. And really, when it comes down to it, though, there's 3 things that happen or don't happen in an interview. And that usually results in you getting or not getting the job. One is, were you technically correct? Okay. Are you giving technically correct answers? That means someone asks you a question and there is an answer to it. And you need to be able to give the answer accurately. Maybe it's about how you would use a certain coding language, or you'd have to write a piece of code, or maybe it's about how you would solve this specific process-based sort of problem, and you have to use the right steps. 1 + 1, you say 2. If you say 1 + 1 is 3, they're like, wrong. We probably aren't going to hire you. So that's the technical component of your interview. Then there's the presentation part. The presentation is more not what you say, but it's how you say it. Do you get lost in your stories? Are they difficult to follow? I interviewed someone at one point in my career who kept using people's first names and mentioning these people to me, and I had no idea who these people were. So I'm giving and Brad said this, and Joanne said this, and I'm thinking, I don't know who these people are, and so I had to keep going back and be like, well, who is this person? Like, why are they important to the story? And it diluted their presentation, and it really, what it demonstrated was a lack of awareness that I didn't understand what they were telling me because they weren't giving me enough context. So that presentation component can be a big gotcha and it is for most people. That's what gets most people, is presentation. And the third piece is simply skill and experience. Like I said, right now, it is a hiring company's market, right? It is not a candidate's market right now. And so sometimes you have done everything technically and presentation wise that you could do as perfectly as possible, and someone else just has experience that is a little more aligned or a little bit bigger or, more complex, and they're selected versus you. And I think at the end of the day, if I'm beat out by somebody because I did what I could control, and if they chose somebody who had an experience that I simply didn't have, I can look at that and say, look, I could go spend time building that experience and closing that gap, but that's a pretty valid reason to lose out to someone else. But if it's your presentation or if it's your technical responses, those are things you can fix. And so that's typically what I spend time is the strategy. What are they asking? Why are they asking you this? How are you answering it? Have you noticed you say these things? Let's think about this. Let's go back. Let's practice. I'm going to give you some homework. Come back in a week. We're going to do this again. That's how I prep with somebody when we do interviews. So we do the reps in a safe space together so we can work out all the bugs. By the time you get into the interview, you're very aware of what your gotchas are, and you've been practicing to build some habits and some behaviors that hopefully counterbalance those.
Gotcha. Well, Erin, thank you. If someone's listened to this and they're thinking, man, I need that coaching, I'm clearly in that situation. Where can they find you and to try to use your services?
Every day on LinkedIn. So I'm Erin Lewber on LinkedIn and Instagram as well. And you can also go to erinlewber.com, my website. And so through the website, I've got a contact me form. I've got a link tree. LinkedIn, like I said, DM anytime. I answer all my DMs. So that's probably my biggest hangout is LinkedIn. I mean, that's how we met. So that's where I spend most of my time on social media. I don't do too much of the other stuff.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I've spent much more time on that than anything else for sure lately. But thank you again. Thank you for your time. I definitely want to have you back so that you can, as I so delicately put it, I can let you tear my resume to pieces.
That would be kind of fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just did that with LinkedIn, actually, with my profile with somebody. I just had somebody go through it and I said, hey, listen, if it stinks, tell me it stinks. Yeah. So I'd love to have you back so that we can do that with resumes, because I know resumes is a big topic. Everybody has an opinion on it. It's definitely different than it was in 2015 of what people want you to have. Yeah. But anyway, would love to have you back, and thank you so much for coming and spending your time.
Thank you for the invite. This was fun.
Yeah. Well, that'll do it for this episode of the Job Seekers Journey podcast. Thank you again to Erin for that amazing conversation. I cannot wait to have yet another one with her, hopefully soon. As I mentioned in the intro, we have some amazing guests coming up. And in particular, one that I am extremely excited about is one that I am having with Alvin Day. Alvin Day is a motivational speaker. He is a life coach. He is an all-around amazing guy. And in that conversation, we are going to talk about how to find and identify what your intrinsic value is, and then how to convert that and communicate that to make that into economic value for your future company. It is a conversation you do not want to miss, along with my conversation with Jessica, who is a TikTok influencer who has so many amazing pointers for people that are looking for job opportunities, as well as a couple other interviews that I have coming up. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, thank you. I hope that this brought you a lot of value and a lot of information and a lot of encouragement, which is the overall goal of this podcast. If you've listened to this podcast for a long time and you know someone who is going through a job search, who is a little bit down because the job market is tough, who is looking for information, looking for someone to identify with their issue, this is the podcast for them. So do me a favor and please share this podcast with anyone you know who may benefit from this information. I also would ask you to go on to any of the places where you may listen to this podcast, whether it be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, anywhere that you can find podcasts, and simply rate and review this podcast. That helps me get in front of more people. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please like, please subscribe, please make a comment, start that conversation, and get this more in front of more people. From all of us here at the Job Seekers Journey podcast, we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.